It was raining the day they brought the moving truck to Emma's new house. Not a drizzle, the kind of sideways rain that made everything look like a glossy photograph, slicking the gravel, darkening the hydrangeas, turning the driveway into a river that reflected the chandelier light from the foyer. I stood on the sidewalk in old shoes and a raincoat I had patched, because it was the one thing I owned that smelled like home, and I watched men in green uniforms carry a box labeled China into a house the paper said was worth $2.8 million. Emma smiled at me the way she always did when she wanted me to mean something small and pretty in her life. "Maddie," she said, sharper than the rain, "they'll get to you after the ceremony. We need everyone to look their best tonight." Her bridesmaids' dresses were blush. The whole thing was blush. Guests moved like figures in a window display. My hands smelled like old books and lemon oil from the bookstore where I shelved other people's stories for 20 years. That day felt like a pattern. My presence acknowledged only when convenient, only to complete someone else's portrait. For 20 years, I had been the daughter who liked closets full of first editions more than closetfuls of social proof. I was the one who took leftovers from family gatherings and turned them into dinner, while everyone else labeled me sensitive or impractical. At graduations, I got the polite applause from cousins and the single tepid hug from my parents. As if my choices were a personal disappointment they were letting fester. I learned to make myself small in rooms where my voice might otherwise have taken space. Books became my sanctuaries. The worn armchair at the back of the shop where I worked, my manuscript folded under my pillow, a narrow balcony with a single plant on the 3rd floor of an apartment nobody seemed to notice. That doesn't sound dramatic on paper, but you live long enough in a family that has quietly decided you are a lesser version of who you might be, and it calcifies into 1,000 small cuts. You always choose the wrong jobs. When will you get serious? Stop being so dramatic. 20 years of being treated like nothing doesn't happen in one speech. It happens in every skipped birthday, every job opportunity. We couldn't swing for you. Every time congratulations were saved for someone else in the family photograph. It was a slow, steady erasure. And then, somehow, all the rules changed with a single flimsy thing, a paper lottery ticket I bought on a whim at Pete's corner store. Pete found me the morning after Emma's housewarming, when the rain had finally stopped and my coat hung in the same sad way it always had. He was the kind of man who wore his years on his face and treated stories like a currency. He'd known me since high school. He owned the bodega 2 blocks from the bookstore, and a heart big enough for anyone who wandered in to ask for something. "Hey," he said when I pushed through the bell. The little bell chimed an honest sound. "You come in for one of those coffee shops around the corner?" "I was passing," I said, brushing water from my hair. He handed me a receipt for the ticket I'd forgotten I'd bought. "Picked one up for a laugh," I told him weeks before, "to dream." He laughed, the way you laugh at something fragile but beautiful. Then he looked at the numbers, and his expression folded, as if someone had asked him to stop breathing. "Would you sit down?" he said. His voice had that measured hush people use when delivering news that might become a life. He slid the screen across. The numbers matched, not a little matched, every last one, 97 million. The figure itself was a kind of unbelief. For a minute I couldn't move. I remember my knees hurting as if I had been walking through a storm for years and suddenly had to stop. The bookstore's clock ticked on like nothing else could change. I felt ridiculous and a little ashamed for the giddiness that rose in my chest. This wasn't a story about clever planning or ambition finally paying off. It was a blip of fate. I have never liked the idea that one rash moment should define a person, but I can't pretend it didn't plant a seed that something different was possible. Pete did the practical things like a guardian who has been waiting for the right time. He refused to let me call my parents. We didn't talk to anyone besides Caroline, a sober, efficient attorney Pete trusted, someone who spoke in short sentences and made the word privacy sound like an ironclad shelter. We signed the ticket in a quiet little booth in the back of his store. Caroline explained trusts. the need for discretion, how to set up a structure that would protect more than money. It would preserve the option to live on my terms, not anyone else's. She told me the media would come, that there would be calls, and that I should think of this as a turning point that required thoughtfulness, not fireworks. After the signing, I walked back past my bookstore. The display windows had a sign taped crookedly to the glass, Local Author Night Friday. My name on that flyer was not my name. My name still belonged to the margins inside my manuscript, to the late-night words I tucked into a drawer. I had been small for so long that the idea of moving differently felt unfamiliar. So I chose a way forward that felt like me, modest, rooted, and stubborn about dignity. I bought a small house through a trust she set up, a place with a reading nook and enough sunlight to keep plants alive. I left the bookstore quietly. Pete folded my last paycheck into a book-shaped envelope. I didn't throw money around. I set up a publishing company, Bennett Publishing, because stories had saved me, and I wanted more people to have the chance to be read. I started a literacy foundation to put books in hands and stories in mouths. My money was a tool. It was not a remedy for the years of being unseen, but it was a means to build what had been missing: respect, a platform, a place where voices might matter. You can imagine, of course, that news like that doesn't stay politely contained. When the press found out, it was like someone opened a window to let a sudden wind into a quiet house. Within a week, my phone screen filled with numbers. The calls were from strangers at first, then from acquaintances, then from relatives whose names had once been behind the polite nod at holiday dinners. My parents called twice, one call that sounded like curiosity, the other a thin tremor of pride. Emma texted a photograph of her chandelier with the caption, "Congrats, surprised, call me." She used my childhood nickname in the way she had used it for years: casual, ownership wrapped in a bow. And then they came in person. They arrived like a flock that had noticed a windfall. My mother stood at my doorway in a coat I recognized from her best Sundays, clutching her perfume like a talisman. My father wore the look of a man who thought money might be a new ledger he could understand. Emma walked in last, a bouquet squeezed into one hand, her smile brittle. "Madison," my mother said, as if inviting me into a conversation she was then going to direct. "We saw the news. We're so proud." I opened the door wider. Inside, the house smelled of lemon oil and paper. My manuscript lay on the coffee table, under a coaster to keep it safe from the condensation of their champagne glasses. For a moment, it felt like all the years of smallness and being delicate rested on that table, and I wanted to tell them the story of how invisible had felt inside my bones. They did not come for conversation. They came with lists. "We've been through hard times," my father said, which was true if he'd meant himself. "We thought we could lean on you for the family fund." My sister's gaze flicked to a small stack of envelopes on my counter. She had always been good at reading a room and making a plan. "There are things we need," she said. "Loans to cover, legal fees, James's." She shrugged, as if the word debt were a mispronounced object that could melt if we didn't name it. I looked at them and thought of 20 years of being told to accept the family's verdict on my life. I thought of the times my mother had asked me to make space for their reputation, and my father had dismissed my dreams as youthful delusions not worthy of dinner conversation. I had been overlooked for promotions they never claimed were sexist, had been laughed at for taking a low-paying job because it didn't look like a career path. When they made a face about my apartment because it was small, I learned to fold myself down so their comfort didn't need to be threatened by me. I set everything on the kitchen table: the signed ticket, now a legal artifact, the 3 envelopes I had kept for moments like this. The first envelope had $110,000 for Emma. It was enough to clear the loan she had begged me to co-sign years before and never properly repaid. The second had $15,000 folded with the care of a penitent little gift. I thought of the cumulative small loans my parents had lent me when I was younger, always with the unspoken expectation I'd be grateful and quiet. The third envelope was not cash. It was an invitation, a printed plan for the publishing house and the foundation, a clear layout of how the money would be used. It showed where their money could go without changing the terms of my independence. Emma's throat worked. "You paid it off?" "I did," I said. The sentence was small and careful. "You can use it, but not as a gift to take the easy way. There are books here," I said, tapping the plan, "and people who can run programs. If you want to be part of this, there will be work involved." My voice stayed calm. I will not pretend it had no tremor. I had practiced this in my head for days, but it still felt like standing at the lip of the ocean. My mother frowned. "We thought—" "I know what you thought," I said. "It is tempting to think money erases everything. It doesn't. It changes the options. It doesn't change the past. It changes the future if you let it." For a beat that felt like a small miracle, the room was quiet. My father let go of his anger for the opportunity to be practical. "You could invest in the family business," he offered. "No," I said, "but I can hire you, not to run my life, but to work with me." I pulled a sheet with a few roles listed, the ones I had already imagined as sensible possibilities. Senior advisor for someone with experience and backbone, fundraising for someone who knew how to dress a room and make connections, project management for someone who needed structure. You can apply. There will be interviews. There will be expectations. This is not a handout. This is a chance to do the work. It was an odd, decisive moment. The currency of their begging for easy reprieve swapped for the offer of dignity through responsibility. I had no appetite for being weaponized as a rescue. I had decided years ago that forgiveness and enabling were different things. I could be generous without allowing generosity to be a leash. They left with the envelopes. Emma cried in the car, which felt mean and small to witness. She had lived in a house we could both see on the same street, but that I could never afford, and in her mind the social architecture crowned her while leaving me unadorned. She had been raised to expect a certain life, and when that expectation became threatened, she expected me to rebuild it for her. I had rebuilt, but on my terms. In the months that followed, Bennett Publishing became more than a name on a letterhead. We converted a square warehouse into a place that smelled like glue and hope. Shelves hammered together, plaster dust in the air, string lights wound over tables, where people who believed in words gathered. Caroline helped set up the foundation with a trust that protected the organization and kept the door open to accountability. We hired editors who loved manuscripts the way some people love houses, a small administrative team who paid attention to receipts, and an outreach coordinator who had once taught adult literacy classes in a community center. The work itself soothed me. Contracts, ISBNs, blindly good conferences, the small thrill of an accepted manuscript. The first heavy moment of validation came when a child named Sophie, brown curls, an earnest third-grade look, and a practiced scarred fingernail from a habit of turning pages, submitted a story to our program. She'd been part of the literacy initiative that brought books and volunteers to a public school in a neighborhood we partnered with. Sophie handed me a folded piece of paper in a school hallway on a rainy day, not unlike the one when Emma had a mansion moved into the neighborhood. It was a story about a little girl who spoke to the moon. "I wrote it at recess," she said. "Ms. Harper said I could give it to someone important." She looked at me like the world might still be full of people who could be trusted to read a child's honest line. I read it that night, sitting in my reading nook where the sunlight made a strip of gold across my manuscript. Sophie's voice was bright and imperfect in the nicest way. We published her story as a small chapbook and sent copies back to her class. A photograph of her holding her own book made the rounds at the office, and someone framed it and put it on the shelf like a small eclipse, the kind that asks you to look twice. Meanwhile, news outlets painted the narrative less delicately. Bookstore worker becomes millionaire was a headline that made my stomach flip. I had tried to stay private, but privacy is porous when money's involved. And into that porous world walked my family again, this time not with envelopes only, but with an act they must have rehearsed. An ambush during the launch of Bennett Publishing. The launch was an evening I had planned to be beautiful in the small ways that mean so much to me. Paper invitations, a local poet reading an essay about the quiet places, tea served on mismatched cups that smelled of orange peel. We had authors, journalists, and neighbors. The renovated warehouse filled with the warm glow of people who had worked with me to build a space that wasn't about spectacle, but about craft. I remember thinking how strange it was to host a party for people who loved the very thing I'd been allowed to be small for. Books. I kept catching Pete's eye from across the room. He had pinned a little cloth pin to his lapel like a medal earned for patience. They arrived together, Emma and my parents and James, in suits that seemed too new, as if they were borrowing dignity in the same way we'd all borrowed chairs. The room buzzed, and then a hush fell when they walked up to the small podium where I was scheduled to speak. A hush is a curious thing. It can be reverent, but it can also be a weapon. "Madison," Emma began, her voice tight, "we think it's wonderful what you've done. But there's a lot at stake. Our family has lost money." She made the word "lost" heavy, as if a life of diminished means were the worst possible crime. "We need assistance." At that moment, the lights seemed to sharpen. I had anticipated this. I had anticipated the way their wounds would look like demands. I had done my homework. The launch night was not an opportunity to be shamed into paying for anyone's whole life. I was calm. I knew the edges of my generosity. I had grown, in 2 months, a thickness around my decisions that kept me from being hurried into good-intentioned mistakes. "I understand," I said to the room, and then to them. "I understand that the suddenness of this is overwhelming. I also understand that a life restored through someone else's charity is not the same as a life rebuilt through effort and purpose." Emma's mouth opened like she had been given something unsaid. "You're saying we have to work?" "I'm saying we will do something that gives people responsibility. Yes." I had rehearsed the phrasing. Responsibility was kinder than accountability, though it held the same backbone. I can offer positions within the foundation and the publishing house. They will be real jobs, with expectations and performance, not symbolic titles. They will require training and deliverables. James, who had always been more boy than man in my family's eyes, looked at me like a man caught between wanting rescue and wanting to be seen as capable. "What if I don't want to work?" he asked, a childishness that still lived in his voice. He was honest, his hands curled into his pockets like a protective shell. "Then we can offer pathways," I said. "Volunteering that becomes training, mentorship, the possibility of apprenticeships. There will be evaluations. You will not be handed cash. You'll be asked to build something that can stand on its own." It was not that I was cruel. It was that I understood the corrosive effect of being bankrolled without expectation. I had watched people I loved degrade into habits that served no one well. I wanted to offer them a way that protected their dignity. No shame, no spectacle, but clear boundaries. The room was a mosaic of faces, supportive authors, nervous relatives, staff watching with quiet interest. My father, who once had such stubborn pride he would not ask anyone for help, took a slow breath. "You'd be willing to have me on as an advisor?" "Yes," I said. "You can advise on the business elements you do understand. You will sit on a committee with oversight. The role is advisory, not controlling. If accepted, there will be reports every quarter." My mother's eyes filled. She placed a hand on my arm the way she had on wedding days when she wanted to claim me as proper. "We never wanted to be a burden," she said. "You're not a burden," I said. "You are family. You are expected to contribute in ways that are respectful of this work." Emma hesitated, then said, "What about me?" "I have a fundraising role," I said. "You have an eye for events. If you want to use that, it will be to raise money and awareness for the literacy programs. It will require measurable goals." She looked at the crowd and then at me. The anger she had once carried like a coat had thinned. She nodded, almost imperceptibly. They accepted, but not all at once. Acceptance was slow and practical, not emotional. There was resistance, there were arguments, but there were also small movements toward the kind of responsibility that feels like a muscle. I want to be clear. I did not relish their discomfort. I did not delight in them needing me. My anger about the way I'd been treated was not a tool I wanted to wield. The point of my offer was not a moral triumph, so much as an attempt to reshape the dynamic into something humane. Forgiveness without enabling is both kinder and harder. It asks you to love someone enough to say, "This will not repair you unless you repair yourself." I had been tending to that difference for years in my private life. Now I had the means to implement it in practice. As Bennett Publishing grew, we began to measure our impact in small human terms. A repaired roof on the community center that hosted our weekly reading club. An adult learner who read a book to their child for the first time. Sophie, now 12, who had a short story in an anthology and a shy smile when we invited her to read. We held readings in the warehouse and in school gyms, and we paid authors fairly, a detail that felt revolutionary to me. Money was being used to create dignity. There were moments when the weight of visibility returned. A reporter wrote a piece that framed me as the woman who forgave her family. It was flattering in a way that flattened the complexity. Forgiveness wasn't a single act. It was a practice balanced with boundary. When Emma's old patterns resurfaced, I had to be clear. There were times the work demanded that I say no. No to early morning calls about bills. No to being a human ATM. Those were not ruthless decisions. They were the edge of self-preservation, the place where one protects the life one has just built. My father, who had once equated worth with profit margins and the length of one's suit, discovered an unexpected tenderness for the kinds of small details that made publishing work, tracking advances, understanding outreach in neighborhoods that never had white-framed invitations. He had pride. His pride changed shape, a little like a river-carving sandstone. James, who had been reckless, found steadiness in project management. He liked lists and timelines and the mechanical comfort of progress. Emma, surprisingly, became our fundraiser with a kind of fierce competence. She learned that the applause earned at a charity event was quieter and more meaningful than the applause from a ballroom. It turned out that the very skills she had used for social dominance had an ethical container in the right setting. We paid back some of what was owed, not because a ledger demanded it, but because I believed in clearing harm when I could. I had carefully repaid Emma's $110,000 loan and folded $15,000 into a small restitution for my parents' earlier loans, not to erase the years, but to close an account so we could begin a new one on honest terms. Those numbers will not fix every bruise. They will not absolve old criticisms. But they were a practical acknowledgement that some debts should be settled before one builds a future. There were critics who read it as a novel of revenge, and others who called it a fairy tale. Neither fit. It was a messy, human thing. Complicated families, grown people making choices, a lottery that served as a catalyst and not a solution. I guarded the truth that luck had brought new options, but the work, making it mean something, was deliberate and fraught. At the core of everything I did was a stubborn belief that dignity matters. That belief informed how we structured job offers, how we paid staff, how we treated contributors. It informed the small way we invested, not in flashy houses for an entourage, but in a warehouse that smelled of glue and stories, in a mobile library that delivered books to neighborhoods, in paying teachers to lead workshops that were once done for free. Money shifted the axis of possibility, but it did not, and could not, manufacture character. One of the last times I speak with my mother, months later, she sat on my worn couch and watched me read a passage from a novel we both loved. Her hands shook when she turned the page. She had never been one for books. I read aloud a paragraph, and when I finished, she surprised me. "I used to think success was about appearances," she said, voice small. "I thought it meant having a house that looked like a postcard. I'm seeing something else now, people being steady, being useful. I'm surprised at how satisfying it is." Her admission was not the end of a story. It was a beginning. It was a sign that their needs had shifted from entitlement to participation. Sophie read at our 5th anniversary event with a confidence that made the room swell. She had a school desk-buckled smile and spoke about a character who refused to be quiet. When she finished, people applauded in a way that felt like sunlight, warm, patient, bathing the room instead of burning it. I thought about the long arc from my patched raincoat on the sidewalk, watching movers carry a box into a mansion, and I thought of how both scenes were stitched together by the same thread: who we choose to lift up and how we do it. There is a cruelty in narratives that reduce life to a single moment. She won the lottery, therefore everything changed. That is not my story. My story is full of small, ordinary acts of care. Hiring an editor who believed in a strange manuscript, paying an assistant a living wage, calling a teacher to ask how to better serve a community. Luck gave me options. Character defined how I used them. When my phone rings now and it's someone from my family, the call doesn't catch my breath the way it once did. We talk about budgets in terms that make sense. We argue about event decor. Once, my mother sent me a photo of a stack of paperback copies being packed for shipment to a school with the note, "We did a good thing today." It was not a plea. It was a small pride. I don't tell this story to make anyone feel bad. I tell it because it is possible to take a moment of fortune and use it to make a life that stands for something better than what came before. I had been the daughter who was told that her love for stories was a liability. I became the woman who used a gift to build rooms where stories mattered. I did not do it to punish the past. I did it to prevent the past from repeating. If there is a simple lesson here, it is that wealth meant more when it was used to create work, not dependency, to teach adults how to stand again, not how to remain upheld. It was not easy. It required saying no, over and over, to the seductive voice that would have me fix every mistake with money. It required me to keep funders' eyes on the goal and to remember why I had left the bookstore in the first place, to make sure that the quiet people, the ones with manuscripts in drawers, the ones whose voices are easy to overlook, have a table to speak from. Sometimes I still find my manuscript under the coaster on the living room table. Some chapters are written and ready, others need patience. There are days when I read old passages and remember the girl who folded herself small because the world told her to. I do not miss shrinking. There is a satisfaction in living in full scale. To anyone listening who has been made small by the people who are supposed to love you, I am not going to promise a miraculous fix. I will not tell you to buy a lottery ticket. What I will say is this: boundaries are a form of love for yourself. Generosity can be structured in a way that preserves both your heart and your safety. When you hold on to your worth, it forces others to reckon with the contours of their own. That reckoning is messy, but it is sometimes the only path to change. The rain still smells like possibility, not because of chance, but because of what happens after you make a deliberate choice, where you plant your money, whether you build walls or doors, whether you ask people to meet you at the level of work and respect. In my kitchen, the envelopes are tucked in a drawer I only open when it is necessary. I look at the framed photo of Sophie on the shelf by my reading nook and feel a steady, quiet pride that has nothing to do with headlines. It has everything to do with a life being used to make room for others. If you have a story about drawing a line or about making a choice that changed the way your family treated you, share it. If this story landed for you in any way, If it made you think about how you might structure your own generosity or how you might set a boundary, I'd like to hear it. And if you want to stay for more of these stories about people who made quiet, principled choices with sudden opportunity, consider following along. There are more stories in the room, and there is always room for one more voice to be heard.